Welcome guys to everything that you'll need to start front-end development. My name is Mrudul Suresh, and keep in mind that this is just from my personal experience after working at my last co-op term where I went from not knowing anything about front-end development to actually creating an industry-level front-end for a startup. If you think there's anything that isn't essential or that I missed, you can comment it down below to help others, but this is just from my personal experience. By the end of this video, I'll hopefully have built a guide that you find comprehensive enough to start learning about front-end and hopefully even start working on front-end development. Remember that I'm only talking about what to learn, and I'm not directly teaching you every single thing about front-end development. HTML and CSS are like the foundational building blocks of building any front end. HTML is basically the raw code that's responsible for everything that we visually see, but CSS is responsible for styling it. HTML adds things like this or this to our website, but CSS allows us to turn those things into these. You've definitely seen HTML more than you think, and maybe even interacted with it, especially if you were like me when you were younger, trying to get free Robux or in-game currencies and using inspect element to trick your friends. You've definitely worked with HTML. I would definitely recommend spending a lot of time on HTML and CSS, learning them and practicing them, as you'll see that without HTML and CSS, you don't really have any front-end development. Honestly, it's pretty easy to learn as you go, so you can kind of just hop into a project and learn as you do. Now, HTML and CSS can take you quite far in building a front end, but JavaScript actually plays a very important role as well. To build an actually functioning website and not just something static, you'll definitely need JavaScript. It allows you to incorporate more complex and very important features such as conditional rendering, data fetching, and even smaller features like smooth auto scroll, and pretty much anything that you could think about. So basically, it adds dynamic functionality to your website instead of keeping it just static. JavaScript allows you to handle any logic that you need on your front end. If you've programmed before, you might find that on a simple logic level, programming JavaScript in your front end might feel a little intuitive. Obviously, there's different syntax and shorthand syntaxes and stuff, but you might feel that it's pretty intuitive. While you could definitely build a comprehensive front end using just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, as was how all websites were created some time ago, I would definitely recommend looking into React.js. React is a super powerful and influential JavaScript library for building user interfaces. React allows us to turn things into components to reuse super easily, which is a huge game changer. React breaks down building components to pretty much the simplest level by allowing us to create a JavaScript function that has a return that contains our HTML and CSS. This is what we call JSX or JavaScript XML. In regular HTML and CSS, you'll find that if you're reusing a component, you're typing out the HTML for it again and again. Even though you might be able to reuse some CSS classes, you might end up typing it again as well. For example, let's take a look at some of my old code. I have standard HTML for my header here, and I have its CSS styling here. Now I also have a hero landing page with its HTML and CSS here, but I want my header to be on top of my hero landing page. What I end up doing is copy and pasting the header over to the hero landing page and also adding all of its CSS styles. Now my HTML page looks like this, and my CSS page looks like this. Let's take a look at the same example in React. You can see that this is my header. It's actually defined as a function called navbar, and you can see that our HTML lies within our return statement. Now at the bottom of the page, we have something extremely important. You can see that we have the keyword export, and we're actually exporting the function navbar. Now if we head over to our layout page, you can see that we have something extremely important at the top of the page. Here, we're actually importing our navbar. Now we can use this component in our page as many times as we like, just like we're doing here. You can also infer from this page that I've done the same thing with the footer, which I actually have. You can also see that we can use the footer component as many times as we'd like. Although there are ways to create reusable components in HTML and CSS, it won't be as seamless as in a framework like React, which natively offers its component-based architecture. Additionally, we can pass props into our function, which is basically just data. Our function can use that data, and as that data updates, our function automatically updates as well. We can look at the video card for example here. Here we have a static video card component that we can use as many times as we want. Now let's say we want to map this card and let it receive information from a backend. Well, our code will change a little to look like this. Now we can add props to it by creating a type at the top of our file. Then passing it into our component, and our video card component changes from this to this. This makes development so much easier, and you can see a huge benefit over just standard HTML and CSS. React allows us to create full stack instead of just static websites very easily. You also get a lot of very important hooks from React. For example, we have useState and useEffect, which are very worth learning about in React.js. Well, to quickly summarize, in order for your website to show up at the top of browser searches, you need to focus on search engine optimization, or SEO. Now, in order to improve SEO, it's important to focus on server-side rendering, or SSR. SSR actually gives us two main benefits. One, better search engine optimization, as we just talked about, but also better performance as a second benefit. Server-side rendering is faster than client-side rendering because the server renders the entire page on the server itself and sends the fully rendered HTML page to the client. Client-side rendering, on the other hand, requires the client to download and execute the JavaScript before the page can be rendered. Now, if you've already done some research, you'll find that standard HTML and React are both typically client-side rendered. Now that you know that that's something we want to avoid, I think you'll come to appreciate my next point a bit more. Now you might be thinking, why did this guy tell me to learn React just to tell me that I want to avoid it? Next.js is actually a framework that allows us to create fast, search engine optimized React applications. While React is typically client-side rendered, Next.js by default is actually server-side rendered, which is exactly what we want. Next allows us to create React apps, but instead render the content in advance on the server instead of on the client side. Now online bots can search the server rendered page and improve SEO. After receiving this page, client-side rendering takes over and we get back to the function of a normal React app. The whole benefit of Next.js is that it's the best of both worlds. We get fully server rendered content for better SEO and better performance, while also maintaining interactive content for users. Even some of the biggest websites that you visit are built by Next.js, including Nike, Spotify, ChatGPT, and so many more. Even the company that I worked at, our entire app was built on Next.js. Since Next is a framework built on top of React, everything in React is in Next, but not everything that's in Next is in React. Next actually has even more features and even more optimization. For example, Next has its own built-in routing capabilities. It even has its own optimized link tag and its own optimized image tag, and so much more. Now, if you've done your research on React, CSR, and SSR, you'll find that sometimes components need to be client-side rendered in order to function properly. Let's take a button in my header, for example. I'm using useState to store and update its current value, whether to open my mobile header or to not. And I also keep track of the icon. But after importing and using useState, I get the following error. It tells me that by default, everything is a server component, and to use useState, I need to mark its parent with useClient. So let's go ahead and do that. And there we go. Now everything works. The good part of Next.js is that, like React, we can turn that button into a component. However, even better is that you can mark only that component with useClient. That way, the entire page stays server-side rendered, providing us better SEO and performance, but we still get to maintain the functionality of that button that needs to be client-side rendered by only marking that specific button as a client-side component. Next is definitely a very powerful framework that's in increasingly more and more demand, and it even makes building an efficient full-stack app even simpler. However, if you take a look at any Next or React app, you'll still see that you require fundamental HTML and CSS, so don't overlook that when you're learning Next.js and React. When it comes to Next and React apps, they allow you to use something called TailwindCSS, which I've personally found to be super useful. Now, if you've ever used HTML and CSS or done some research about it, you might find that keeping track of elements, giving them very specific names, switching between a style sheet and an HTML doc can get super frustrating. It definitely gets very annoying naming every single button or container with a specific name and then going ahead and individually styling them. When I first started, I was literally just getting frustrated in just creating a simple header. Luckily, TailwindCSS is our solution to this. If you look at Next or React code, you might see that it looks something like this, where we have some HTML element with class name equals and has a bunch of styles. But hold on, those styles may seem familiar, but they're not the exact same as what we've used in regular CSS so far. That's because we are actually using the same CSS classes, just in a shorter convention. TailwindCSS allows us a more direct approach to styling. Instead of switching between HTML docs and CSS style sheets, we can apply styles to our HTML elements within the element itself. This makes development a lot easier and simpler. We don't even have to think about names for our specific HTML elements. After installing Tailwind in your project, you can use its classes, which are basically just shorter versions of the same CSS classes. Now you may have noticed, when you were using CSS, there was a lot of memorization. I'll be honest with you, it's kind of still the same for Tailwind CSS. You just have to remember that display flex is flex and justify content center is justify center in Tailwind, and so on and so forth. However, if you already know CSS, Tailwind becomes even easier because you can just go online and look at their doc and just search whichever class you're looking for and quickly find the Tailwind shorthand of the same class. This is why I would recommend being comfortable with CSS before going for Tailwind CSS, but like I actually have no idea if everyone agrees with that. When using Tailwind CSS, it's important to note that there's a lot of pre-built classes, like text large, which is basically just CSS font size 1.125 rem, and W64, which is just with 16 rem in regular CSS, and so on and so forth. You could actually just hover over the Tailwind class and it'll show you the full regular CSS behind the shorthand. But at the end of the day, whether you choose regular CSS or Tailwind CSS, there'll always be some trial and error towards finally finding the perfect styling that you want for your element. It's also cool to note that you can use large, small, medium prefixes in front of your class to apply certain styles for certain device widths. These are called media queries, and Tailwind CSS makes them so much easier to implement. Oh, one more tip is that you could use Control and space to bring up autofill, which will show you all the different options you have for what you're already typing. Not gonna lie, I've already talked a lot about Tailwind CSS, but I have one more thing to say about it. Here's a recap of the benefits of Tailwind CSS. So what about the cons? Well, does it have a solution? Yep, it actually does. At the end of the day, you could just head over to globals.css and style one component regularly as you would in regular CSS. But then again, you can still reuse that name again and again, so is it really even that big of a problem? So even though I've seen that Tailwind CSS is a little controversial, I would definitely recommend using it or trying it out, and especially on bigger projects too, it could be very helpful. JavaScript is already so useful, but let's make it even better. Now we have TypeScript. In JavaScript, we can reference variables that don't even exist, and a lot of the time we actually deal with objects of unknown types. This means that you can actually interpret broken code, and you won't catch it until runtime when the browser throws an error at you. TypeScript allows us to prevent these errors by extending JavaScript with types. Just like Next and React, TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript, which means that everything in JavaScript is in TypeScript, but not everything in TypeScript is in JavaScript. You can see here while using TypeScript, we get immediate feedback on errors. This is super useful since we can troubleshoot our errors long before our code is even interpreted. Another huge benefit of TypeScript is that it helps us with static typing. We can annotate our code with types, and this becomes super useful when we're dealing with objects. We can define the types of an object in an interface and apply that interface to a regular JavaScript object. This way, we'll always get autocomplete in our code. Well, that is pretty much everything that you do need to start learning and working on front-end development, but I would like to talk about DaisyUI. To be honest, DaisyUI is actually extremely helpful. It's a component library that works as a plugin for Tailwind CSS. We already talked about how a huge benefit of using Next or React is that we can create and reuse components super easily. But what if somebody already created a standard component for us? That's exactly what DaisyUI does. If you take a look at their website, you can see so many different components that are pre-built. There's even various options for each component. You can literally just copy and paste the JSX and you get the same fully functioning component in your code. You can still customize that same component in your Tailwind CSS to customize it and style it as much as you want. With all of the components that DaisyUI gives us, you could actually build a really good looking and fully functioning website in literally just a matter of minutes by copy and pasting a bunch of DaisyUI components. It's also good to note that some DaisyUI components can technically track state and have functionality without actually using useState, and they don't actually need to be rendered as client-side components. This means that we can still push maximizing the amount of our app that is server rendered, which we've already talked about is one of our huge priorities. Although it's definitely not necessary to build a fantastic front end, DaisyUI can be very helpful in not reinventing the wheels again and again. This makes development even quicker and simpler. And isn't that exactly what programmers look for? Efficiency? In my experience, ChatGPT has actually been extremely useful, especially for searching up really small things. For example, when I asked how to map an array of information to display, asking ChatGPT straight up gave me the exact response that I was looking for. Even asking something like, what Tailwind CSS class can I use to add an orange border, can yield very helpful results. If you're looking for a small syntax, or you're just stuck troubleshooting, or you just can't find some really small solution online, it's definitely worth giving it a shot and asking ChatGPT. Obviously, I wouldn't always recommend just copy pasting especially large chunks of code from ChatGPT into your code, but sometimes for smaller code, it can definitely work. One thing for sure is that I would definitely recommend using ChatGPT to help you learn. Well, that should hopefully be everything you need to know to start effectively learning about front-end development. And if you feel like I missed anything, feel free to let me know down in the comments so that you can help others as well. This is all just from my personal experience working on front-end, because when I first started and knew nothing, I found myself super lost and confused, just jumping from random tutorial to random tutorial. I obviously know, and I wouldn't say that I'm some crazy professional at front-end development, and I still know that I have a lot to learn, but I'm just trying to help out anyone that might need it. Also note that when you first start, you might feel like your development speed or your efficiency is kind of slow, and it probably will be. but trust me, the more you practice and the more you do, it will improve a lot. Well, anyways, my name is Mrudul Suresh, and thank you so much for watching. I hope this video helped, and I'll see you guys later.